What do you say at the end of the Republic, except that you have just gone through a great work of art as well as a irreplaceable work of philosophy? Now, I wouldn't be the first person to say that there's this great irony with Plato, especially with Republic, is that you have one of the greatest poets of his time, Plato, condemning poetry, and in a book which does deal with poetry very harshly. It ends with a poem of a certain sort. The myth of Ur, the story of Ur, which is certainly, I can't help but think, Plato's original uh, creation. Um, you know, you know, it really is. Reading the Republic is humbling in so many ways, and one is that you realize that to really get a hold of it and to work out all its ironies and problems, you'd probably need to be a more educated and intelligent person than you are. I mean, at least that's my feeling about myself. Something ridiculous in me trying to say something about the Republic, but we share our experiences. That irony that Plato was, of course, a philosopher, the most important philosopher of all time, but also someone who had incredible creative and poetically creative abilities, and the dialogues are his great poems, and they are also, philosophy, but there's no separating the philosophy and the poetry in Plato, especially in dialogues like this one, Republic. It's just very, very odd that in Book 10 of the Republic, after going through so much, he would return to the subject of poetry, which he's already spent a good deal of the earlier books talking about. But that is the Republic in a way, right? I mean, that is that Book One seems like it could have stood on its own as a complete book, but we're free to speculate. Plato thought that there was more to be said. That is that he had that it was important for him to return to the subjects and the questions that were raised and try to work them out more fully. Obviously, at the end of this book, if indeed it's been handed down to us in the form in which Plato was imagining it, that he felt he had to return to this subject of poetry, which seemed to have been thoroughly dealt with earlier in the Republic, and we're left with the question: why? It's the mystery. We can speculate, but we'll never know what Plato's motivations were to really continually return to certain themes that are raised in the book, and to have more to say about them. The discussion of Homer in the first half of Book 10 is really astonishing. I mean, that is, one believes what one's told about Greek culture and the incredible importance of Homer, author, or we would say perhaps kind of semi-mythical author of the Iliad and the Odyssey, because of course we don't have as much assurance as people in Plato's time did that the Iliad and the Odyssey were the product of one person. But if we think about the place of Homer in the ancient world, not just in Greek culture, but if you read about the Romans, I mean, reading through the Iliad and the Odyssey was a central part of becoming an educated person. I mean, kind of like, I suppose, like, um, even I don't know if there's anything really comparable in our culture anymore in terms of a book or set of books. I mean, one could probably say that until quite recently, familiarity with Shakespeare and the King James version of the Bible was comparable in terms of centrality and commonality and importance, and a general recognition that we relied upon those sources for our education, for to be educated about the world. My understanding is that that was the presumption about Homer, that unless you had read through Homer, you really didn't know anything. He was that important. And so for Plato to criticize him and to ultimately reject him as an educator is quite something. And again, as a poet himself, and his reasons for doing that, I suppose, have to be understood within the rest of the book, and especially the theory of human nature that is in the book. And the first thing that we sort of have to grant Plato is that he loves poetry, and that he just assumes, or Socrates assumes within the Republic, that his, who's he talking to? Is it Glaucon in Book 10? That he loves it too. They all love poetry. I mean, they're Athenians. They're the place where the great festivals of poetry happen, and people are awarded prizes for being great poets. And poetry is, one would imagine, is like a national pastime. And so Plato, or Socrates, within the dialogue, acknowledging the incredible power of poetry, and as he says at some point in Book 10, Socrates says, "Well, we act like men in love with regard to poetry. We love it, but as in sometimes being in love, we realize that the object of our love may not be good for us." Which is a very difficult position to be in, to truly love something and have at the same time a notion that it may not be good for you. What do? Do you surrender yourself to that love, nevertheless, or do you sort of ruthlessly cut it out? I think that Plato is saying you have to ruthlessly cut it out, and here there's a great struggle, great debate about the true nature of education. Humanistic education in the modern world, we would say, is to read Shakespeare, to read the great poets, to read great novels, to experience opera and music and great works of art, all of which appeal to our imagination and those parts of us that Plato does not think should be in control of us. But our notion of what it means to be an educated person, uh, at least to have a liberal education, those experiences are vital and that they're good for us, to read Shakespeare and to live out in our imaginations the tragic fates of those characters, to look at their suffering, to, to see to appreciate their flaws, and in a way to love their flaws, because it's what makes them so interesting. We think of this kind of being affected, this kind of pathetic experience, being affected by a work of art, living along with it, being absolutely essential to becoming a literate, humane, educated person. Of course, there are other aspects of education too, but and, for Plato to reject them, if he indeed is rejecting them, and we need to read it more closely, is quite shocking to us. But coming from a man who's not only a great poet, but a great lover of poetry, obviously, he seems to have earned that right. That is, he loves poetry more than anybody, and he therefore sees the power of poetry more than anybody else, or as much as anyone else. And so, if anybody has the right to be wary of it and to be suspicious of the effects of poetry on the soul, it's Plato. We don't have to go along with him in our suspicion of the effects of poetry, but certainly we couldn't possibly reject it. I mean, what kind of position would we have to be in to do that?